When we met in Toronto 2 years ago, I spoke about the topic of inclusion and exclusion, how right to die laws would, depending on how they are shaped, would include some people who would be eligible, and how it would exclude some other people, and what would be the consequences of that. And I also talked about how we could possibly go forward and combine different models, especially the medical model, where physicians are involved, in the model which is without physicians. And I would like to extend on that a little bit, on an exclusion-inclusion topic, and sort of bring that together and also possibly show a way forward. What I'm going to say, there may be some criticism in it. It's not meant as negative criticism towards any country which does a legislation. It's not meant as a negative criticism against any politicians who work hard, or any advocacy group that works hard to get a law. It's meant as an input, as something to think, just to think about. The talk that I did in Toronto, if anyone is interested, I have a few copies. Come and see me and I'll give you a copy of that one. We heard a lot about stories about how people suffer, either when they have a chance to access assisted dying law and when they are not. And I always think this is a tough sentence, because it's a tough thing, because it's so difficult to describe suffering. There are hardly words to describe the suffering, but actually it is the bottom of all. It's not the question whether you have a certain diagnosis, which is listed in the ICD tabella, International Classifications of Diagnoses. And in Toronto I talked about extending that towards the International Classification of Functions tabella, look more at that. And I would step forward and say, go a step further and say, let's look at what is it actually that the person says that they are suffering of. And if we then take the definition of the World Health Organization, we often think as if you have this diagnosis, or if you have that suffering, or if you are thought to live 6 months or 12 months, then you should be eligible, and you are not healthy. The World Health Organization says a different thing. It says health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of a disease or infirmity. So in other words, from my perspective, and maybe a little bit provocative, when we had some discussions in Switzerland about healthy people being allowed to have access to a physician-supported assisted suicide, voluntary assisted dying, I came up with the thought, there are no healthy people who want to access assisted dying. Someone who wants to die has some sort of suffering. Someone who wants to die is not healthy. The key point is to go to that person, go to the bottom of it all, and see what is wrong. What is the problem that brings the person to the point of saying, I want to end my life? And talk about that first before we go into categories and thinking about, oh, is it terminal, is it incurable, is it a completed life or not? This complies with what the European Court of Human Rights said in the case that Dignitas did in the year 2011. It said, right to die, or the freedom to choose your end of life, is a human right. And it didn't say anything about conditions that you have to be terminally ill or incurably ill. It said you have to be competent and you have to be able to make the decision and carry it out. But it didn't say that you need to have a certain terminal illness or a life expectancy of 6 or 12 months. And beyond that, in 2020, the German Constitutional Court added to that, it's not only a right which is, or a freedom to choose beyond any diagnosis, it's also a right to reach out to help of third persons and make use, if they voluntarily offer that help. Of course, we all agree that there is not yet, and I don't think there will never be, and should not be, an obligation on any state to provide assistance in dying. Can't be an obligation, just as much as there can be no obligation on doctors to provide assisted dying. It should always be free choice. If we ask for free choice for patients, we have to give free choice to doctors and everyone involved. However, the state does not have permission to stand in the way, to hinder people who are competent to access assisted dying. I show this base decision from the year 2011 from the European Court of Human Rights, and that court doesn't say anything about categories like terminal, incurable, grievous illness, 6 or 12 months to live, or old age polymorbidity, or even healthy people. Actually, healthy people in the sense of what I said at the beginning, that they have some sort of suffering, they could access assisted dying. But as I said, healthy people would not choose it. So we have to go and put these categories aside and go to the base of it. What is the case with that person? What is the issue? Now the problem is, why do we have restrictive laws which only allow certain categories that I just showed? The problem is the top-down, bottom-up thinking. A lot of people who think they are in power, like politicians or certain medical professionals, think, I know what's best for my patient. I decide who gets access. It's a power game. Who do we allow to have access? Well, that's wrong thinking. That's a paternalistic, arrogant, ignorant thinking. The basis, and when we look at the human rights judgment, there from the European Court of Human Rights, is a bottom-up. We already have that right. We have that freedom of choice. All over Europe, at least. It's there. And we shouldn't think about top-down. How do we do a law which, at least where we get a majority and which allows certain category of people to get access to assisted dying? We should think bottom-up. The individual, their suffering, they have the right, and how do we reclaim that right that we already have? And beyond that, talking about suffering, assisted dying needs to be thought, embedded in many different approaches to soothe the suffering. When I say that the person who wants to die quite probably is not healthy in the sense of the World Health Organization's definition of health, and that person has some sort of suffering. Again, I repeat myself, what do we do with that suffering, and what is the solution to relieve that suffering? And it's not necessarily assisted dying, which is the best choice. There are many roads to assist, to support, to empower a person to find what is their best solution to relieve the suffering. To wrap it up, more or less, category thinking, these criterias, and Dr. Nick Carr yesterday from Australia gave a very good example what can be the negative consequence of restrictive eligibility criteria. He told us how he wanted to help that gentleman who had been living in Australia for so many years, and just because he didn't have citizenship but only residency, he couldn't help him. And that man went back home and within 5 days choose a do-it-yourself suicide at home, with all the inherent risks to it. So this category thinking to allow to permit assisted dying for certain types of people is arrogant. It is causing difficulty. It is actually violation of the right to life, which we talked about yesterday, where we had a presentation then. Because people who are excluded are put at risk to take to do-it-yourself suicide methods, and from research we know that out of each death by suicide, 10 more people tried and failed. Even research going back to the 1970s that is saying there are up to 50 suicide attempts and 1 person dies by that attempt and 49 survive. When we exclude with this category thinking, when we exclude all these people, we put them at risk to take things in their own hands and potentially fail and be worse off afterwards. So what we really need is, what I tried to show with that slide before, we need a more human-centered soothing of suffering instead of category thinking. Going back to, what is this all about? It's about the individual. It's about the patient or the person. It's about a human right. It's about that person, their situation, their story, which we heard a lot of stories these days, and take that person serious and work together with that person at eye level to see what can be done to improve their situation. The above is a quote from a Swiss newspaper. The fact that a phenomenon like going to Switzerland, that is assisted dying tourism, exists at all is a fundamental failure of politics on the part of countries with restrictive laws. These politicians, are abandoning their citizens in a desperate situation. This puts it to the point. We in Switzerland, Dignitas and other organizations, we don't want any more foreigners to come to our country to make use of our liberal assisted dying law. I do think that 26 years and 4,000 people from abroad coming to Dignitas and making use of our law is enough. What we need to do is get going and get laws that respect patients, that respect people, and take care of them, and do not leave them to take the do-it-yourself suicide methods or to go to Switzerland. Thank you. I think we have 3 minutes actually left. I was faster. So if there's a last question, either now, Jenny, if you allow, or otherwise see me around. What do you would like? Let's speed up. Next speaker.
I will keep going.
Perfect.